Mercedes just got exposed, because what looked like pure dominance might have been powered by a hidden engine trick. The FIA has now stepped in to shut down, and the moment they did, the performance gap started collapsing. For 3 races, this system was giving extra power exactly where it mattered most, worth up to a decisive advantage on a single lap, enough to control qualifying, control track position, and control the race before it even started. But here is what makes this explosive. It was completely legal, until it became impossible to ignore. A safety risk, a technical loophole, and a rival team that chose to expose it instead of copying it. Now the FIA has new evidence, new restrictions are in place, and Mercedes is losing multiple layers of performance at the exact moment the competition is closing in. And the biggest question is no longer how they did it. It is how much they lose now that they can't. It all started quietly, and that is what made it so effective. Because in the opening races of the season, something felt different. Mercedes was fast, yes, but this was not just speed. This was precision in the exact moments that matter most. Especially in qualifying, where the final part of the lap suddenly became their strongest point. At first, it looked like perfect execution. Clean laps. Strong exits. Better traction. But here is where things didn't add up. The advantage was always appearing in the same place, the final straight, just before crossing the line. That is where time was being found. And in Formula 1, when performance appears in the exact same corner, in the exact same phase of the lap, every single time, it is not random. It is engineered. Now imagine this like a runner saving energy for the final sprint. Everyone else starts slowing down slightly as they reach the finish. But one runner somehow keeps full speed just a little longer. That tiny difference decides everything. That is exactly what Mercedes, and Red Bull as well, had discovered. A way to delay the drop in power from the hybrid system. Normally, the MGUK, the electric part of the engine, must reduce power gradually when energy runs out. It is a safety rule, designed to avoid sudden loss of speed. But there was an exception. An emergency shutdown mode. A system meant to protect the car in case of failure. And that is where the loophole was hiding. Because instead of letting the power decrease smoothly, engineers realized they could trigger this emergency mode at the perfect moment. Right before the finish line. That allowed the car to keep maximum power for a few extra seconds, and then cut everything after the lap was already completed. The result? More power exactly where it mattered. More speed on the straight. Better lap times without breaking any written rule. And here is the key detail. The downside of that system, losing power for 60 seconds, did not matter in qualifying. Because those 60 seconds happened during the slow lap back to the pits. So in reality, there was no penalty. Only gain. That is why it worked so well. That is why it went unnoticed at first. And that is why, for 3 races, it gave a crucial edge. Australia, China, Japan, all with the same pattern. But here is where everything started to fall apart. Because what worked perfectly on paper started to create problems in reality. And those problems were impossible to ignore. And this is where the story stops being clever and starts becoming dangerous. Because what looked like a perfect exploitation of the rules began to show cracks under real conditions. During Japan, something unusual happened. Kimi Antonelli, in the middle of a fast section of the track, suddenly lost power. Not gradually, not predictably, instantly. At the same time, another car came to a complete stop. And this is where everything changed. Because that loss of power was not a failure. It was the direct consequence of the same system being used to gain performance. The MGUK had been switched off, and the car was left without that electric boost in a part of the track where speed is critical. Now imagine driving at high speed, committing to a corner, expecting full power, and suddenly, it disappears. That is not just a technical issue. That is a safety risk. And Formula 1 does not ignore safety risks. This is the moment when other teams started paying very close attention. Because up until that point, this trick was seen as clever engineering. Now it was something else. Something that could not be allowed to continue. And this is where Ferrari made the move that changed everything. They had already seen the pattern. They understood exactly what Mercedes and Red Bull were doing. But instead of copying it, instead of trying to match it, they went directly to the FIA. Not to accuse. Not to protest. But to raise a concern. A safety concern. And that distinction matters. Because at that moment, the trick was still legal. There was no rule being broken. But safety is different. You do not need to prove something is illegal to question whether it is dangerous. And once that concern was raised, the FIA had no choice but to act. An investigation followed. Data was analyzed. The pattern became clear. And then came the decision. A technical directive. Immediate. The loophole was closed. The emergency shutdown could no longer be used in that way. And just like that, one of the smartest performance gains of the season disappeared overnight. But here is where the story becomes even more serious. Because what the FIA discovered did not stop there. It revealed something deeper. Another advantage, hidden inside the engine itself. And this is where the story goes from clever engineering to something much bigger. Because while everyone was focused on the MGUK trick, the FIA uncovered another advantage, one that was not activated with a button, not controlled by software, but built directly into the engine itself. This one was harder to see, harder to prove, and far more powerful over time. It all comes down to something called compression. Now, keep it simple. Inside an engine, more compression means more power. The tighter the mixture is squeezed before ignition, the stronger the explosion, the more performance you get. But there is a limit. A strict one, defined by the regulations. And every engine must pass that limit during inspection. So on paper, everything should be equal. But here is where Mercedes found something extraordinary. The engine passed all tests when it was cold. Perfectly legal. But when it reached full racing temperature, it changed. The materials inside expanded just enough to increase the compression beyond what was measured during inspection. So in the garage, everything looked compliant. On track, under real conditions, the engine was producing more than expected. And that is the key. Because this was not a momentary boost like the MGUK trick. This was constant. Lap after lap. Straight after straight. A hidden layer of performance built into the physics of the engine itself. Now imagine two identical cars on paper. Same limits. Same rules. But one of them quietly becomes more powerful the moment the race begins. That is the advantage we are talking about. And for weeks, no one could prove it. Because technically, it passed every check. Until the FIA looked deeper. They realized the problem was not the number itself. It was when the number was being measured. Cold versus hot. Static versus real conditions. And that changes everything. Because once you understand that, the solution becomes obvious. You change the way the engine is tested. And that is exactly what the FIA is now doing. They are moving toward measuring the engine under real operating conditions, eliminating the gap between what is legal in the garage and what actually happens on track. And just like that, another advantage disappears. So now, both layers are gone. The short-term boost from the MGUK trick, and the long-term gain from the compression loophole. And this is where the real impact begins. Because when you remove two performance advantages at the same time, you do not just slow a car down. You change the entire competitive balance. And this is where the numbers start telling a completely different story. Because once the FIA removed those two advantages, the gap began to shrink almost immediately. At the start of the season, Mercedes looked untouchable. In qualifying, they were sometimes ahead by around 0.7 of a second. In Formula 1, that is not just an advantage. That is domination. But after the directive, after the MGUK trick was banned, that gap dropped to just over 0.3. And it does not stop there. Because the second change, the compression adjustment, is expected to reduce it even further. Possibly down to just 0.2, maybe even less. Now think about what that really means. 0.7 to 2. That is not a small loss. That is the difference between controlling the race from the front and fighting for position every single lap. And you can already see it happening. Rivals are closer. Qualifying is tighter. The margins are no longer comfortable. And suddenly, Mercedes is no longer operating in a safe zone. But here is the part that makes this even more interesting. Even after losing both advantages, Mercedes is still ahead. They are still winning races. They are still setting the pace. Which tells you something critical. The car itself is genuinely strong. The engineering is real. The foundation was never dependent on the tricks. Those tricks just amplified what was already there. And now, without them, we are finally seeing the true level of performance. No hidden boosts. No extra layers. Just pure competition. And that is where the pressure shifts. Because now the gap is small enough for other teams to attack. Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, they are no longer chasing a moving target. They are within reach. And when teams feel that, everything changes. More risk. More aggressive strategy. More pressure on every lap. And for Antonelli, this changes everything. Because leading from the front with a clear advantage is one thing. Defending under pressure, with rivals closing in, is something completely different. Every mistake becomes costly. Every qualifying lap becomes critical. Every decision matters more. So now the real battle begins. Not just between teams, but between expectations and reality. Because Mercedes is no longer hiding behind technical advantages. They are exposed. And the question now is simple. Was their dominance strong enough to survive without those hidden gains, or was this the moment the entire championship started to turn? And this is where everything shifts from a technical story into a human one. Because up until now, this was about systems, loopholes, clever engineering. Now, it is about pressure. Real pressure. Because when you remove the hidden advantages, you do not just expose the car. You expose the driver. And for Kimi Antonelli, this is the moment where everything changes. At the beginning of the season, he was driving with a margin. A cushion. A car that gave him room to control races, to manage gaps, to stay out of danger. Now, that margin is gone. And when the margin disappears, the smallest details start to matter. Braking 1 meter too late. Missing the apex by a fraction. Getting the tire temperature slightly wrong. Those are no longer small mistakes. They are the difference between pole position and starting behind rivals. Between controlling the race and being forced to fight. Now imagine being in that position. A young driver, leading one of the biggest teams in Formula 1, knowing that the competition is getting closer every single weekend. That changes how you think, how you drive, how you handle risk. Because before, you could afford to be precise. Now, you have to be perfect. And that is where the real test begins. Not just of speed, but of mentality. Because drivers are not just competing against others. They are competing against pressure, against expectation, against the knowledge that one small error can undo everything. And this is where rivals sense opportunity. Because when a dominant team suddenly becomes vulnerable, the entire grid reacts. Red Bull pushes harder. Ferrari becomes more aggressive. McLaren starts believing they can actually win. And belief changes everything. Because once a team believes the leader can be beaten, they stop playing safe. They take risks. They attack strategies. They fight for every position. And that is when championships turn. Not in one race, but over time, through small moments, small mistakes, small gains. So now, the story is no longer about what Mercedes lost. It is about what everyone else gained. A chance. A real chance. And that is what makes this moment so important. Because the FIA did not just remove a loophole. They reset the balance. And when the balance resets in Formula 1, nothing stays the same. So now the final question becomes unavoidable. With the tricks gone, the gap shrinking, and the pressure rising. Can Antonelli handle a championship fight without that safety margin? Or is this the moment where everything starts to slip away?